Great. Okay.
Great.
Welcome everyone, and great that you've joined today for this fantastic series of events. I'm David Hill. I founded and I chair the Environment Bank. Back in 2007, I was concerned that development wasn't really delivering great value for biodiversity and that we weren't doing things correctly. So I've been lobbying hard, and eventually it looks like we've got Biodiversity Net Gain to be part of the mandated part of the planning system. What I'm going to talk about here is a partnership with planning authorities that we're putting together and offering to enable delivery of Biodiversity Net Gain. I should say I also chair the charity Plant Life, and I sit on something called the Food Farming and Countryside Commission. We've got lots of interesting things all coming together and interlinking. And I've actually, in the process of setting up the Environment Bank as the Environment Bank Foundation, which is going to be a not-for-profit. So that will be a really interesting innovation. So without further ado, well, we know that the Environment Bill will mandate a minimum 10% biodiversity net gain. All planning authorities will be required to deliver it. Developers will need to submit a biodiversity gain plan showing where the 10% above the baseline condition will be delivered. And while some biodiversity net gain will be on site, that's for sure, it is very expensive. I can talk to you more about that at another point. And it isn't that great, I don't think, for biodiversity. So we're talking about brokering large-scale sites by raising conservation credits on land, creating habitat and managing it for 30 years, something that we've called habitat banks. We're looking at setting up partnerships with planning authorities to help them and provide the end-to-end solution for them in the future. So at the moment, there are a good number of planning authorities already dipping their toe in the water. This shows a map of those. And of the 380, I think 90 or so are already engaged or engaging. So what is a habitat bank? Well, they're 40 to 100 hectares areas of land dedicated to biodiversity restoration. They can provide value added by being linked to existing sites of conservation value, which is better, bigger and joined, and much better for biodiversity. And we use delivery agents of landowners, farmers, wildlife trusts, other conservation NGOs and community benefit societies. The Environment Bank's job is to validate it all, raise and register and validate the biodiversity unit gains from land management using the government metric, which is a industry standard. And we take on all the contractual arrangements with the landowners and developers. So this graphic shows four parts to how it works. And this is how we think the Habitat Bank will deliver biodiversity net gain for developments and I'm talking here to the planning authority, as if you were a planning authority. So on the first part, it says development assessment. We go and measure the impacts and work out the compensation that's needed, or we validate those that are done by others. We then work out the compensation requirement once any BNG on site has been proposed and shown and validated. And then the Habitat Bank is set up, and that sells conservation credits to the developer under a conservation credit purchase agreement and a letter of sale. And then the biodiversity benefits are shown there, enhances land for long-term biodiversity and societal benefits with a biodiversity management plan. You'll see this slide, you'll get this slide in the pack, so I won't look at the detail of this, but the role of conservation credits is pretty critical insofar as it enables a functioning market to be involved in the supply, the banking and the brokerage of sale of these credits, which is where we register the value from. I won't go into the detail of that, but basically there's the supply of habitat banks, the administration of the conservation credits and the sale of those to developers, all of which we do. The first thing that we would want to do with a planning authority is to look at what the demand requirement would be for a 5 to a 20-year planning horizon. And this shows you this is a real life example. It shows you an example of, if you see the top 4 lines there, 584 hectares that will be allocated for development in this particular region. And if you look at in the box towards the left, of that 584 hectares, if we assume a net developable area of 80%, obviously big, large developments can get 60% net developable area, but we've taken an 80% value. That gives 460 hectares to be developed. If you then apply the UK land cover statistics to a 100-hectare area on average, that yields around 358 biodiversity units that's on that land that will be lost. So the amount lost for this example is around 670 units. If you add your 10% gain, and it gets you to 1,837 credits. And based on something like between 240 and 320 credits for a 40-hectare woodland or wood meadow, as an example in this case, we would need 230 hectares to compensate properly for that 584 hectares lost. So we do that analysis for planning authorities. The habitat types that we are promoting are wildflower meadows and grasslands, wood meadows. So the Wood Meadows Trust has been doing a lot of work in this area and has come up with some great methodologies and showcase an example at the Escrick estate, which is terrific if you ever get a chance to go and see it. Woodlands, of course, and I'm not just here talking about tree planting. There's a great difference between planting trees and creating a woodland, as I'm sure you know. Wetlands, and then rewilding. We think that large-scale conservation through rewilding can have value and actually ought to be funded in some shape or form by the sorts of value that Biodiversity Net Gain can bring to the operation. The two main things that conservation has ever had in its whole, say, 100-year history or more has been access to land and access to finance. If we get the access to finance correct, which we can through Biodiversity Net Gain, if it's done properly, we can get the access to land at scale. And if we're going to deliver 500,000 hectares of a nature recovery network, that's a lot of money, and it's going to take the private sector to get involved at proper rates for doing so. In terms of setup and management, there are three parts to it really. If you look at the left-hand side, I'm talking there about what do we do for a developer. So we engage with the developers, either with the planning authority as part of the assessment of the application, or directly for the developer themselves. But we treat our work in an independent way. We measure the impacts of a development in biodiversity units using the industry metric, because that's an objective, solid, standardized methodology for working out what the biodiversity units on a development site are. And we also will give help in creating the biodiversity gain plan or gain report that would be provided for the developer that he has to now submit with his application in the future when this is mandated. In the middle sits the habitat bank that we will have found, and we find that with or in partnership with the planning authority and with various stakeholders. And we also want to look for choice so that there is no ransoming involved in all of this. I can talk more about that later if need be. But the habitat bank is essentially established, and where the planning authority works in partnership with us, this gives certainty to third-party investors. And third-party investors are really important in funding the startup, the creation of a habitat bank from which those conservation credits will be raised and that we then administer on behalf of that habitat bank. We have a conservation bank agreement with the landowner, farmer or conservation body. And it's a 30-year agreement which satisfies the compliance of the, as will be in the Environment Act when the bill's enacted. And then we have a biodiversity management plan, and the landowner farmer gets paid in accordance with delivering the objectives of that plan. So at the moment where biodiversity is created or retained obviously within a planning development site, there is very little proper enforcement and deliverability over that into the future, because obviously planning authorities are pretty strapped financially, and there is just not the resource to do it. And I think at the last count, only 31% actually had ecologists on board working with them and for them. So obviously we also work with wildlife trusts as well in terms of identifying where land can be. And we're just about to, we started actually setting up a large inventory called the Nature Network Registry, which is looking at large scale habitat restoration schemes, including rewilding, but also lots of other initiatives from for example, where living landscape sites are, because these will identify already spatially where we would like to perhaps see that biodiversity net gain funding being targeted. And of course, nationally and locally, we know that that there is work being done on national and local strategic frameworks for nature recovery network, etc. So we work with all of that, and we'll spatially work with that to identify where those habitat banks can sit, so that they give us the best banks for our bucks. And then the work that we do with the planning authority, I've mentioned the demand analysis undertaken on their behalf. We then sell the credits, track their sales against demand. We assess future need, because obviously as credits get sold or extinguished from Habitat Bank, we need to know where the next credits are going to come from. So there'll be a rolling program of creating those Habitat Banks. And we provide the annual monitoring and Habitat Bank reporting to the Planning Authority, so that that aligns with their biodiversity duty reporting too. In terms of finance, we think there are 3 areas that we will be funding through this. The tier 1, this is where the majority of the income from sales of conservation credits will go, and that will be held by our not-for-profit EnvironmentBank Foundation. And we take brokerage and transaction costs for the works for doing that. Then there's tier 2, and this is we think this will equate to between 5 to 10% of the net credit values that we will spend with conservation NGOs and other relevant bodies to extend nature reserves or set up bespoke conservation sites. They might be projects that might, for example, be involved with within field management interventions to increase biodiversity or to create wildlife corridors, etc. And then there's a 3rd tier, which is a pot of funding that we will ring fence, and local young people will be asked to bid to finance setting up small environmental projects in their area, such as at ward level. So there's 3 tiers which will satisfy the demand for the sorts of environmental projects. And I sat on the Ecosystem Markets Task Force some years ago, and we thought that the actual value of biodiversity net gain would be in the region of about £1.2 billion per annum. And when we consider how much we're spending on biodiversity conservation at the moment, but biodiversity is still not going well, we really do need to get this level of investment directly into new habitat creation and restoration schemes at scale. In terms of timeline, well, 2020, we know, although there are problems at the moment, aren't there, but the Environment Bill is progressing through Parliament. It will come back hopefully very soon. We then look at the detail of what the Habitat Bank will look like, with its management objectives, the logistics planning being defined. We're in the process of raising the initial investments, probably of around 10 million or so, to start the first few Habitat Banks with chosen planning authorities. We sign an MOU with that planning authority. The credit calculations are made, the biodiversity management plan's written, and the Habitat Bank prospectus will be written and submitted and agreed with the planning authority, so that we set up the detailed demand analysis again, and that we've got a system that's oven ready to go to sell credits to developers. And then we've got the Environment Bill hopefully enacted in law next year, and so on. And then we've got reporting through from 2022 to 2024, etc., to the planning authority. Very quickly, the benefits. Well, for the environment, biodiversity has to be the top one. Biodiversity enhancement through habitat creation and long-term management. Carbon sequestration, of course. Land taken out of intensive agriculture, which removes it from pesticide use, conserving soils and reducing runoff. Large-scale improvements to landscape quality, and the creation of a land use mosaic and a richer, more diverse land cover. For the development industry, the value is very significant, because it gives a quick, cost-effective and transparent solution for developers to deliver their biodiversity net gain requirement, delivering real biodiversity value that doesn't constrain a development needlessly, and it removes their 30-year liability for managing land within the development site that makes little contribution to biodiversity conservation. And we can have lots of debates around what biodiversity is for. Our focus is to create big-scale biodiversity restoration in the wider environment. Great value for local people, because the sites that we're setting up would look at creating really great new areas for wildlife, but also some access for people to those for quiet recreation, and providing a major uplift of placemaking for local people, etc. And also, of course, a significant income stream for farmers, landowners and conservation bodies. And then finally, the benefits for planning: it makes all the development compliant with the national and local policy and demonstrates leadership, etc., so that it can generate pride in people's local environment. So quick summary: we are in the process now of setting up partnerships with planning authorities, bringing forward large habitat banks. The LPAs can deliver their biodiversity duties, and we determine the development demand. We measure impacts in biodiversity units, which is an objective assessment, and we look to finance an ecologist within the LPAs we work with to ensure all the development is assessed. We identify with those LPAs the strategic location for habitat creation and the restoration and enhancements that are required. And we establish and manage all the contractual arrangements with the landowners, manage the whole end-to-end process. And we undertake all the contractual arrangements with the developers so that it's easy, cost-effective for them to deliver their biodiversity net gain requirements. And we think really this is a win-win for nature conservation, planning and development. Local people, opportunities for obviously health and well-being, climate change resilience, landscape quality and local governance. And that's a really quick run through. I know that you will get this presentation through the Land app, but very happy to take questions either now or over the coming days as those questions might come to you. And thank you very much for listening.